All right, good afternoon once again, and I'm picking up here. Now we're going to talk about in this next screencast the political economy of the Inca Empire. And the Inca shares actually, and you'll probably notice this as we go through this, it shares quite a few similarities. There are a lot of comparisons that can be made between the Inca Empire and the Aztec Empire. And of course, like any two societies that are similar, the danger can be that you just lump them together and assume that what's true of one is true for the other. So that's not, of course, the case here. So we do want to make sure that we employ some distinctions, some contrasts as well. But you may, just to help you here at the beginning, you may see some similarities. And of course, just a reminder that what we're really looking at here is the political economy of the Inca, and sort of the ways in which this society answered important questions about the resources of the society, how those resources are distributed, how they're valued, who's responsible for producing, who has the privileges of consuming those resources, and of course this raises unavoidable issues of wealth and the way in which value and utility can be placed in a storable form. So with that, let's go. Here's a map that'll help us understand. The Inca were hundreds of miles south of the Aztec Empire, but these empires did, for the most part, exist simultaneously to one another. And it's also worth noting they're going to be conquered by the Spanish within a pretty reasonable time frame, just over 10 or 15 years. And yeah, let's call that good for now. I guess one concept I want you to take from this image is the road system. And as we'll mention later, the Inca were master road builders. The pathways through their empire was along the order of 25,000 miles, which is an astonishing amount of road construction. Not all of this was done by the Inca themselves. Some of this was done most certainly by the Andean societies that existed in the run-up to the Inca Empire. Oh, and my pause earlier. I also wanted to point out that both the Aztec and Inca Empire existed for a surprisingly short period of time before the Spanish arrived and effectively ended the run for both the Aztec and the Inca Empire. And it's easy to think that they were around forever since they're such vast and powerful empires, but the truth is they only existed for a little bit over 100 years as they at their height prior to the arrival of the Spanish. Here's Machu Picchu, which is one of the most photographed and the most iconic images of a Inca stronghold. And this, of course, is high up in the Andean mountains, and a place that I have put on my bucket list, a place that I definitely want to see before it's all said and done. Okay, so let's get into talking more specifically about the political economy. And one of the ways we can do that is understand a little bit about the cosmology, the ways in which the Inca thought about their world and their role in it, and then we'll also talk about how they hierarchically ordered power within their society. And so first off, from a religious perspective, cosmology and religion perspective, the Inca had, sort of like the Aztec to the north of them, a two-tiered system of belief and a pantheon of gods. And some of those gods were at the local level, and we could think of them as being like animist, not unlike the Japanese Shinto tradition, where caves and mountains and glaciers and trees and meadows had their own minor gods that inhabited them. and the Inca were mindful of those areas and engaged in something akin to worship of those nature spirits. But then they also had what we could call the big three, which were three pretty critical gods that were across the board, something that all of the Inca people would have believed in and worshipped. And the first was their creator god. You'll hear this name pronounced Viracocha, and this was a sacred and important god. And then probably the most important god was the god Inti, which is the sun god. And that was a critical part of the Inca cosmology. And then the Inti Ilapa was also an important god, the god of thunder. And these gods were critical, and it's also worth noting that the leader, we could call this person the emperor, but historians usually refer to the Inca emperor-like person as the Sapa Inca, who was like the lead Inca. And the Sapa Inca was believed to be a descendant of the sun. So there is, as was typical in a lot of cosmologies and ideologies of ancient world civilizations, in the case of the Inca, there's this tie between the sun and the earthly ruler, the Sapa Inca. From there, the world was divided, or I'm sorry, the social hierarchy was divided into aristocrats, the wealthy, and it's worth noting that in the case of the Inca, when there was the death of the Sapa Inca, the males in the line of that Sapa Inca would fight it out and contest one another to be the next ruler. And this had indeed just happened. And so when Atahualpa, the Sapa Inca, he was the Sapa Inca upon the arrival of the Spanish, he had just defeated his brother in a pretty epic sort of civil war to determine who would become the next rightful ruler of the Inca. And that quite possibly factored into the success that the Spaniards had in conquering a much larger army under the Inca. Then under the commoners we have the Ayu, and the Ayu were not altogether unlike the Calpuli of the Aztec, but the Ayu were again sort of kinship clans that were they all paid homage to a common ancestor, and they would exist in units of 10 households, and then 10 households would be through the Inca census rolled into a unit of 50 households, and then 100,000 all the way up to 10,000. And when you started to get 10,000 households pulled together, that would be about the time where a aristocrat would be in charge or tasked with administering and overseeing that unit. But the Ayu was a critical element of the Inca social order. Many functions were held together through that institution, including, again, not unlike the Calpuli, oftentimes an Ayu would be responsible for a particular craft. So they might weave together the fibers of the llama or alpaca. They might be farmers. An Ayu might be responsible for building roads, so on and so forth. And that was a critical element of the Incan political economy. The Inca followed a complex ritual calendar. As I mentioned earlier, they paid respects and homage and worship to both the local gods and the main gods. Occasionally they would participate in human sacrifice, most often at an important ritual time in the ritual calendar. If the circumstances called for sacrifice, they would typically sacrifice both a young male and a young woman together. There are accounts that at times of the passing of a Sapa Inka, there might be thousands of people who would be sacrificed to sort of go along with that great king into the next world. And that was an important part of the cosmology. And then one other thing, you're looking here at an image of a mummy. The Inca practiced what was called mummification, and normally it was a way of preserving the life or the quasi-life of an aristocratic or royal ruler. And so they would try to maintain that person. They would sort of preserve them, mummify them, bring them out from time to time, put food and beverage in front of them, and almost carry on as if that person had never deceased. And so there's just sort of an effort to try to preserve and maintain the power and importance of select important individuals within Incan society. Probably hands down the most noteworthy part of the Inca political economy was the way in which they held together such a vast, sprawling empire. And this image on the right is what remains of an Inca warehouse. And so one of the distant, sort of isolated Inca cities, they would all have this storage capacity, and it was important. It was an important part of the success of the Inca, because what they would do is have various Ayllu or Ayu gathering and harvesting and preserving food, and then they would stash them in these remote warehouses. They weren't really remote. They were part of the various Inca villages, but they were remote from the central capital in Cusco. And so what this meant was that if the Inca Empire determined at some point they needed to engage in military business, perhaps there was some social unrest in a distant part of the empire, they could mobilize soldiers to go sort of occupy or otherwise stabilize that part of the empire, and then they would know that there would be a warehouse full of food to help sustain the Inca military in that far out place. Similarly, the administration called upon the empire to keep elaborate track and do censuses, conduct censuses, and then that would allow them to do this mita. And the mita was a system of labor taxation, whereby based on the numbers of people in a given area, the empire could count on the labor of the male head of household, the male heads of household throughout that area. And so this was critical to helping stock the warehouses, to help them build roads, which inevitably allowed them to be more connected with the empire throughout. A lot of the ways in which they maintained their records, the Inca did not have a written language, but they had this interesting device known as the quipu. And quipu were, as you can see here, a knot tying system that allowed them to track important and large numbers of different things, whether it was they could keep track of censuses like population counts, or debts and ledgers, whereby maybe one merchant owed the empire. A lot of them keep track of things like taxes, so on and so forth. So quipu is really important. And before I wrap up here, I want to talk about the verticality of the Inca landscape and its ecosystems. One of the real successes that the Inca had was in the Andean highlands. They lived in a place that had such varying elevations that different plants and animals could exist at different elevations along the mountains. So the growing season in a mountainous environment is constantly changing, but there's oftentimes always an area that has the ability to support growing conditions during a given year, and this was very important to their success. And I will close with that. Take care.